So let's get oriented. These are three really high level ways of thinking about FEMA that are just helpful as context. The first is a really simplified version of FEMA's org chart. So FEMA sits under DHS. There's the FEMA administrator, which is appointed by the president. And then FEMA, very simplified, is organized into three big buckets. There's resilience, like share. This is not the office of, this is just resilience. It's just one name. There is the Office of Response and Recovery, which handles everything basically once a disaster is declared onward. And then there's mission support, which runs our operations. When you have a really big organization that is broken into two big operational arms, resilience and ORR, Office of Response Recovery, even the best efforts at trying to work across these organizations sometimes break down. So I often find it useful that people understand that these are two, that sometimes the mitigation and preparedness sides of the house and the response and recovery sides of the house aren't as in great of sync as even people within FEMA wish we were. The other thing that you can see is that FEMA has 10 regions that operate basically like mini FEMAs for the states in their region. And those administrators, regional administrators, report to the up through the FEMA administrator, not through the resilience and ORR arms. So there's a lot of different pieces within FEMA, and this has caused a lot of problems outside as people try to understand FEMA because there's a lot of different arms of the operation you can be talking to. The other thing that's just useful to understand about FEMA context is this disaster life cycle. So a lot of people that work with FEMA or its programs work just with one piece of this, and even people within FEMA often work within one piece of this disaster life cycle. But you can really understand, those of you who've been working in disaster management for quite a while, that there's different phases of the disaster recovery life cycle or the disaster life cycle that are always going on that are going on at different phases. They often blend over each other. And the useful thing to understand about FEMA is that FEMA does think about disasters this way, as you're doing preparedness all along, or you're doing preparedness, you have response, you then have this long recovery tail that starts during the response phase but extends it a long time after. And you have resilience and mitigation happening throughout. The other important thing to keep in mind is that while a community might be dealing with this at one point of this phase, FEMA is often managing dozens of disasters at different phases of this cycle. And so it's really helpful to kind of understand where we are in the resource flow. This graphic here was actually created as a resource flow graphic for the response and recovery periods to show that there's a big spike when response, and then there's this long tail of recovery resourcing. Let's get straight to the business. Where does the money go? So FEMA has about a $30 billion budget, and that budget is grouped into different appropriations, which are basically just ways that Congress defines that money has to be spent. So there's six appropriations for FEMA. One of them is very small. It's about nuclear programs. So we're just going to talk about these five, and we're really going to focus most of this presentation on the Disaster Relief Fund, or the DRF, which is the vast majority of FEMA dollars, and it is also the one that funds all the stuff that you all are working with after a disaster is declared. Just for context, though, the other money goes to the National Flood Insurance Program Fund, National Flood Insurance Fund, which funds the NFIP. That's the flood insurance work. The federal assistance appropriation, that funds all the preparedness grants. A lot of them are anti-terrorism focused. It also funds all of the FEMA training for emergency managers. And a lot of those grants fund the actual emergency management capabilities in states. But that's all funded through this federal assistance, or FA, the green boxes on the screen. We then have about $1.4 billion that Congress appropriates for operations and support that funds the about 5,000 FEMA permanent staff, as well as all of the facilities, IT systems, etc. So all the money that was saved by all the federal employees it left, including myself, that comes out of the operations and expense. And then we also have procurement, construction improvements, that funds these like kind of longer term, big picture investments. A lot of them are facilities or IT investments. So when we're talking about the FEMA budget, it's $30 billion. Most of it goes to the DRF. And then we're going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about the money within the DRF and how it flows down through the communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so The disaster relief fund. We're going to talk there are different types of declarations, which basically unleash this money for communities, for states and local governments. Most of what we're talking about when we're talking about a declaration are major disaster declarations, but there are also emergency declarations and fire management assistance grants. If you want to know more about that, that's a separate presentation. We're going to be talking about major disaster declarations, which are about 95% of FEMA's funding, DRF funding. In order to have a disaster declaration, a major disaster declaration, two things have to happen. You have to have a state or a tribal government request the assistance from FEMA, and then you have to have the president approve the declaration. You may hear about other factors like the public assistance threshold or other ways of signaling whether or not a state should get FEMA assistance. But ultimately, all of those indicators are just ways that FEMA has created to provide unbiased and rigorous assessments to make recommendations to the president for when or when not to declare a disaster. The deciding factor has always been with the president. This has never really been an issue before. Most of the time, the president has taken FEMA's recommendations. Recently, we have seen that that may not always be the case. So when a state or tribal government requests a declaration, they request both that a declaration is made, and then they also request the specific programs that they would like to have access to: public assistance, individual assistance, and hazard mitigation. And we'll talk about each of those in turn. Normally, when these programs are approved, with the exception of some individual assistance programs, the there's a cost share where the federal government pays 75% of the full cost and the state provides 25%. Different states then have different mechanisms for splitting that 25% cost share between the state and the local governments. Sometimes with major events, the federal government, the president may decide to up the cost share for the federal government to be 90 or even 100% for different types of reimbursements. Declaring a disaster also gives FEMA a lot of powers. So when the Stafford Act, when disasters are declared, FEMA becomes the central coordinating body for the federal government. And then FEMA is now able to request assistance from other agencies to help manage the disaster through what we call mission assignments. And so when a disaster is declared, what happens is, and it's approved, the state will start making requests to FEMA for assistance of various types, and FEMA will start figuring out how to best fulfill those requests, leveraging the full force of the federal government to come in and support. We also have FEMA will play different roles depending on the size of the event and the state or tribal government requesting the support. The smaller the event and the more state capacity that the local government, state and local government has, the smaller role FEMA will play. It will maybe more of reimbursements or just slight technical assistance. As events get larger or as state or local capacity is weakened, FEMA can step in more, but that looks different in each disaster. Oh, there was one more point I wanted to make quickly before we move on, which is there's a lot of there have been a lot of conversations recently about how every county in the United States, or 99% of counties, have received a major declaration. That is true, but it also obscures from the data about where that money is going. And as we'll see in a little bit, just because every county has received, or most counties have received a major declaration, that does not mean that money is evenly flowing across the United States.
There's a question in the chat from Claire. Can state designated tribes, as opposed to federally designated tribes, apply for assistance?
I am going to have to ask the FEMA people to double check me on this, but my immediate answer is that only federally recognized tribes can apply on their own, and that state recognized tribes have to apply through the state. Among the many changes of FEMA in the last year or so have been that the Open FEMA dashboard was taken down. And so it actually makes it a lot harder to track where the money is going. So we're actually, for this presentation, instead of creating a bunch of new tables and charts, we're going to rely on charts that were published by the Congressional Research Service and that show a lot of the same things that we're going to try to talk about. But I want to flag this for everyone. And then there's a few things that I haven't been able to find or that we want to kind of say at the beginning without a chart to show. The first is that when you're talking about FEMA disasters, you can kind of break it down into three big categories the, based on the size and the significance. The first is COVID. So if you're looking at FEMA data, you really first need to ask yourself, does it include COVID-19? COVID-19 response and the money that flowed through FEMA dwarfs all the other disasters. It's about $150 billion. It's a big thing. So if you're looking at FEMA data, always know if you're looking with COVID. The second is that there are about six catastrophic events that have happened in the last 25 years. And those events are major spikes in FEMA spending, and they often represent major shifts statutorily or operationally in how FEMA works. And those are things that most people will know when I cite them. They're 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And when you look at a map that shows where FEMA dollars have flowed over the past 25 years, the states that experience those disasters are going to pop out. And we'll see that in a little bit. The other more than 1,500 events are the other disasters that FEMA has responded to over the past 25 years. And I think a lot of times people forget that FEMA often manages somewhere between 75 and 100 disasters each year as communities across the nation are being overwhelmed by events. All right, so let's get into some of the programs. Next slide, please. Okay. So once you have a FEMA declaration, money is spent across these different money from the DRF is spent across these different buckets. There's public assistance, which reimburses state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and certain nonprofits for response and long-term recovery work. There is also individual assistance. This is money that flows directly to survivors through the state. And then there's hazard mitigation grant programs and the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program that are both hazard mitigation programs that are intended to reduce the impact and cost of future disasters. When you look at where the money has gone over 2020, you see that over half of DRF spending actually goes to public assistance. So this is money from the federal government to state and local governments. I'm going to briefly cover public assistance, individual assistance, and then Joel's going to cover the hazard mitigation programs before we open it up for questions. So what public assistance, what does PA pay for? PA can be divided into two big categories of work. There's emergency work and there's permanent work. So emergency work often starts even before a disaster is declared, and it's the work to reimburse states for debris removal and for emergency protective measures. Emergency protective measures is an extraordinarily broad category that covers everything that can save lives and protect public property or protect property in general. It includes the pre-positioning of supplies, search and rescue, the setup and operation of shelters, evacuation costs, the costs of paying overtime for state employees that are managing the disaster, provision of food and water, the cost of running the emergency EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, emergency medical care, anything that is needed to save lives and reduce damage to property immediately during or after a disaster can be categorized as emergency protective measures. Once a little bit later, or even sometimes depending on the severity of the disaster during the initial disaster, we start seeing more money being requested for permanent work. Permanent work is for the repair, restoration, or reconstruction of certain types of infrastructure. And you can see here the types of infrastructure that are typically covered: roads and bridges, water control buildings, utilities, and even parks and recreation. And the buckets here in the kind of rectangular graph show the proportion of money that is spent in each of these categories. And so the thing you can see here is that actually permanent work is the majority of funding spent in most of the last 25 years. and emergency work is a little bit less. In bigger disasters, it's even more so. More money is spent on permanent work and less money proportionally on emergency work. So, how much money do states get? Public assistance is a reimbursement program for eligible work. So basically, that means that once a disaster is declared, and if a state is submitting for reimbursement for work that meets the eligibility criteria, FEMA pays. FEMA has about a 300-page long manual called the PA Program and Policy Guide, or affectionately referred to as the Papa G, that explains in excruciating detail what is and what is not covered by FEMA after a disaster in these categories. As I mentioned before, typically the cost share for the federal government is 75%, but there is no cap. There is no cap per disaster. If a disaster is declared and there is eligible work and the state submits for it, FEMA will pay. Sometimes it will take a long time, as we have seen, but FEMA will pay. And there is no additional decision that is supposed to be made on whether or not a state deserves that money. Statutorily, if it's eligible work, FEMA will pay. Eligibility is determined by these four criteria. First, is it an eligible applicant? Secondly, is the infrastructure or facility eligible? It must be owned or maintained by an applicant. Is the work to repair or reconstruct based on damage from a declared disaster? And are the costs reasonable? So you can see that within this, there's a lot to be considered, and that's why there's a 300-page manual, again, providing excruciating detail on what is covered and what is not. Next page. So as I mentioned earlier, although most counties have received a declaration, uh, where the money flows is not. So actually, not all when a disaster is declared, you may have public assistance turned on and or you may have individual assistance turned on. Sometimes often you will have both turned on, but they're not always declared. So this map unfortunately doesn't show DRF expenditures, it just shows public assistance. But based on what we were earlier talking about how much money goes to PA, I was hoping this graph would this chart would give a good um, kind of proxy for where disaster relief fund money is flowing. And you can see that there's a few states that have received quite a bit of disaster relief funding, and that those states really correspond to the states with those major disasters that we said at the beginning of the presentation. All right, next slide. So this is the only slide I have on the individual assistance program, but basically FEMA funds a suite of programs. I think last time I checked, there were 19 separate programs that are all considered individual assistance. And these are all to help survivors manage the financial, emotional, legal, and other challenges that they might experience during and after disasters. In most cases, these are all funded 100% by FEMA. There is a cost share for the individual and households program. But the main point to recognize here is that the way that FEMA statute is written and the way that these programs were created, they were not intended to be programs to make people whole. They were actually intended to be programs of last resort, only to supplement other existing programs, insurance, philanthropic, community-based, and individual own preparedness. And so a lot of the discussion ongoing around FEMA and policy space is what is the right level of providing individual assistance so that well, I'll just say in the larger social welfare discussions that this country has, individual assistance fits quite well in terms of the same debates about what amount of money should be going from the federal government to individuals. But I just wanted to point out here for data wise, the maximum amount that you can get through that one family, one person can get, one household can get from individual assistance is 87.2 thousand, but on average, IHP participants only receive about 3.5 thousand, $3,500 during a disaster. And so you can see that this doesn't even come close to helping a family recover if they don't have other resources. This is then layered as with other programs like the Small Business Association loans and other programs like from the Department of Health and Human Services. But for FEMA, this is what a family is looking at when in terms of looking at assistance. So Joel, over to you for mitigation.
So I'm going to be talking about FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance programs. FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance programs, their goal is to reduce future loss of life, property damage, and recovery costs by funding mitigation projects. And the core hazard mitigation assistance programs include the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, BRIC, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and I'll also be talking a little bit about the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, which is separate from the BRIC and HMGP in terms of its funding source. So together, these programs support communities facing risks from wildfires, flooding, drought, extreme heat, hurricanes, and other natural hazards. So BRIC is FEMA's main disaster program, and um, it funds projects that are pre-disaster. So like a community would apply for it. It'd be a competition-based programs, and communities could get pre-disaster program BRIC program funding. HMGP is different because it becomes available after a presidentially declared disaster. It allows states and tribes and territories to use post-disaster funding for long-term mitigation projects. Both HMGP and BRIC are funded through the Disaster Relief Fund that Hope talked about earlier. FMA is a little bit different because it's specifically focused on repetitive loss properties under the NFIP, and we'll talk about that later as well. So let's do a deeper dive on each program, starting with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is FEMA's primary post-disaster mitigation program. The program funding becomes available after a presidential major disaster declaration and is intended to help communities rebuild in ways that reduce future disaster risk. FEMA describes hazard mitigation grant program funding as funding for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to develop mitigation plans and implement projects that reduce future disaster losses. The program supports long-term risk reduction measures such as acquiring hazard-prone properties, elevating structures, retrofitting buildings against flooding, earthquakes, and wind storms, as well as improving drainage and strengthening utilities and infrastructure. A key feature of the program is that the funding is tied to the size of the disaster. So what does that mean? So the total amount of funding available to a state or territory is calculated using a sliding scale formula based on the percentage, usually up to 15% of the total federal disaster assistance provided for that specific event. So for regions with a FEMA approved enhanced state hazard mitigation plan, this allocation can jump up to 20%. Even though a disaster might only hit a specific county or town, once the hazard mitigation grant program window opens, the funds can be deployed for eligible projects anywhere across the entire state. And the grant, as Hope mentioned, operates on a standard 75% federal and 25% non-federal match. The remaining 25% must be covered by states or local governments, though it can consist of cash and labor and donated materials. Eligibility and planning are central to the program. So state and tribal territorial governments must have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan in order to receive funding for mitigation projects. Homeowners and businesses generally cannot apply directly, and instead, state and local governments apply on their behalf. That planning requirement is important because it encourages communities to identify risks and prioritize solutions before the next event. So, as mentioned, BRIC is FEMA's main pre-disaster mitigation program. It's designed to help states and local governments, tribal nations, and territories to invest in infrastructure projects before disaster happens. The core policy idea behind BRIC is to shift federal spending from reactive disaster recovery to proactive risk reduction. So instead of waiting for a flood or a wildfire, and then providing mitigation funding after that event, like with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, BRIC funds projects that reduce the impact of those hazards in advance. That includes things like school safe rooms, utility hardening, relocating critical infrastructure out of flood-prone areas, and protecting pump stations. BRIC is similar to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, is funded primarily through the Disaster Relief Fund. It's funded through a 6% dynamic set aside from that fund. Authorized by Section 1234 of the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act, this mechanism basically shifts funding away from annual congressional appropriations and ties it to the program's budget directly to the scale of recent federal disaster spending. So that 6% set aside is whenever a presidentially declared major disaster occurs. FEMA calculates the total estimated federal grant expenditures for that event, and this calculation then aggregates spending across major assistance arms, specifically public assistance and individual assistance. So depending on the amount of money that's spent on those programs in a given year will determine the amount of money that gets put into the BRIC program. Um, and then beyond the 6% set aside, there are legislative funding mechanisms. For instance, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act approved an additional 1 billion explicitly for the BRIC program. And this supplemental funding was structured to inject about 200 million annually from fiscal year 2022 to fiscal year 2026 into the program's total pot. And you just wanted to flag that I'm sure as many of you heard, the BRIC program has gone through a bit of an upheaval over the past year, with it being paused, states suing FEMA for its pause, and then the BRIC program being brought back. And so now this year, there's a notice of funding opportunity available for fiscal years 24 and 25 for states to apply for, and communities to apply for, and that provides about $1 billion in competitive funding. Um, BRIC does not fund 100% of project costs. Instead, it operates on a cost share model similar to HMGP, which is 75% and 25% non-federal match. And the last one I just wanted to cover is the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. This is separate from BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Both those prior programs are funded through the DRF, the Disaster Relief Fund, and are tied directly to disaster sizes. Um, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program is different, and I wanted to flag it because it's one of the biggest programs that FEMA runs in addition to those other two programs for disaster risk reduction. Flood Mitigation Assistance program is FEMA's grant program specifically focused on repetitive flood loss properties and reducing the amount of those properties in a given state. The program basically helps states and local governments reduce or eliminate the risk of flood damage to buildings insured through the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. FEMA, the flood mitigation assistance is designed to lower future flood risk while also trying to reduce the exposure of the National Flood Insurance Program's finances. And some eligible activities are focused on helping support mitigation planning for flooding, technical assistance, localized flood risk reduction projects, and then individual flood mitigation projects such as elevation, voluntary buyouts, or floodproofing of insured structures. There's a key point that I want to make about flood mitigation assistance is that flood mitigation assistance is tied to participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. So to be eligible, projects generally must be located in a National Flood Insurance Program participating community and involve structures that are insured under the NFIP. And communities like HMGP also must have an approved hazard mitigation plan in place. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program is an annual competitive grant program, and for the current funding cycle, FEMA has made up to about $600 million available. FEMA's fiscal year 2024 funding opportunity, which was published last month, gives applicants until August 6, 2026 to submit or revise an application. And as I mentioned, I just want to flag again that this is funded differently than BRIC and HMGP. It comes out of the National Flood Insurance Fund with additional support from other legislative actions like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and it's an annual appropriation that Congress has to set aside from the fund. Usually it's consistent of about $250 million, but with some of the injection from recent legislative actions, that amount is much higher.